A few weeks ago, Genshin released a new endgame mode, Stygian Onslaught. Since then, there have been numerous discussions about the mode and its perceived difficulty. In this video, I want to share my experiences with the mode, how much investment is necessary to clear this endgame at its highest difficulty, and what improvements can be made to make the mode more fun for most players. So let's get into it. Before I start, this is going to be a less scripted video. I think I just wanted to relay my thoughts and suggestions on improvements because there's a survey out for Stygian Onslaught now that you can fill out, and I'm hoping that at least some of the people who are watching this video, you the viewers, will take into account what I am saying for improvements. So with that said, let's start. Before I delve into my experience with the endgame mode, I first have to explain the state of my account. If you watch my videos, you know that I spent most of my resources in underutilized characters for Spiral Abyss, which are often not great at dealing damage on their own and require heavy support buffs to deal necessary damage. As a result, some of the clears I have barely meet the necessary damage thresholds for floor 12. Due to this kind of optimization, I hardly build any DPS characters, as evident by the many 5 stars I have left at level 1. I simply don't have interest in using them at the moment because I personally like to focus on the underutilized characters for Spiral Abyss. As a result, it's simply impossible for me to clear Stygian Onslaught at its hardest difficulty. You need minimum C0 R1 of the recent carries, so something like Mavuika, Kanich, Baressa, Skirk. You need these units at C0 R1 to reasonably clear dire difficulty. I say reasonably, but it still requires a good amount of skill. And if you're trying to use like earlier carries, say something pre-Fontaine, you're going to need probably around C2 R1 investment to clear dire difficulty, not at 180 seconds, but just 2 minutes per chamber. That's the same thing goes for the C0 R1 Natlan carries. It's possible you can get away with slightly less investment depending on how well you play. I've seen a C0 R0 Mulan clear for dire difficulty against the Lava Dragon, for example. So it's not a fully set requirement, but generally what I've seen in terms of clears, that's overall what you need. So as a result, unless I get over my obsession with leaving 5 stars at level 1, I'm not clearing this mode at dire difficulty. I'm completely fine with this. I already knew about this from leaks in the mode beforehand, and I don't really care. It's not my kind of game mode in terms of clearing it at dire difficulty, so that's fine with me. However, my account had another issue, and that is the lack of good cryo damage to deal with the automaton. You don't have to have a cryo DPS to clear the automaton, because if you have a really strong carry like Arlecchino, Navia basically, there are clears made by the community that have outright destroyed this boss. However, I again don't have a lot of these high DPS characters built because of how I've personally invested, which made it difficult for me to clear this particular boss. And the best I could do on release day was difficulty 4 with a C0 R1 Ganyu clear. Also doesn't help that I don't invest heavily in my meta supports generally. The purpose of doing that is to make sure that these supports don't overshadow the underutilized character I use as a DPS in my video. I also have very few 5-star constellations active, with only Jean, Chi-Chi, and Klee having active constellations. Now that you know my account state, let me talk about my overall experience. Starting at single player first. I personally have a lot of tools available for beating both the Lava Dragon and Tulpa at difficulty 5 on my account level. I used Hyper Bloom against the Tulpa, or basically Hyper Bloom, 2 Dendro, 2 Electro, and against the Lava Dragon I just did a 4-star Overload comp. You know, pretty classic, pretty standard stuff. It also helped quite a bit that both of these enemies take damage when you properly address their mechanics, like applying Pyro or dealing Pyro hits to the Lava Dragon or breaking the Tulpa's shield. So the DPS check isn't as stringent as the Cryo Automaton. For the Cryo Automaton, I just could not clear it at difficulty 5 without getting Skirk first. And when I did eventually clear it, I cleared it with a level 70 Skirk and a level 70 Escoffier. And this is 70 out of 70, so they don't even have Ascension 5 stats. This boss is probably the most egregious thing that they've put in this lineup. If you don't address its mechanic properly, you just cannot do anything to it. If you do address its mechanic properly, it just becomes a sitting duck. It's just a very poorly designed boss. I don't like it. A lot of the people I've talked to also don't like it. I understand that 4 stars can clear this boss at difficulty 5, but the amount of investment you need to have on said units is way more than I have on my account. Briefly talking about character restrictions, again, the Cryo automaton is just by far the most offensive out of the 3 bosses. If you don't have characters like Ayaka or Risley or Skirk or Scoffier, or at least high damage dealers like Arlecchino, Navia, Mavuika that you can use along with good Cryo off-field hitters built, it's extremely difficult to even attempt to clear at difficulty 5, let alone difficulty 6. Of course, if you have Skirk, like, this boss is a sitting duck. The Tulpa and Lava Dragon are much more flexible in comparison, but they still greatly limit what characters you can use quite a bit. As for my co-op experience, it was kind of nightmarish. Honestly, before this, I knew some people didn't actively read what a boss does, but it was kind of jarring when I saw someone bring Skirk against the Lava Dragon. Of course, this isn't representative of the entire Genshin community, but based on my limited co-op experience, because I stopped co-op once some idiots started trapping people in their worlds on repeat, it's pretty clear that there's at least a decent portion of the population just does not know what these 3 bosses do, or how to play their characters, or how to just play around these bosses' mechanics. With this knowledge in mind, it heavily influenced what I think would be improvements to the mode for the general audience. So don't be too surprised if some things that you've heard the community say are improvements aren't what I'm suggesting as improvements, because from my point of view, some of the stuff the community is saying in terms of improvements, I don't think would actually help. Some of my experience succinctly, I think the Stygian Onslaught is actually a decent mode, testing diagonal investment. I also think that the energy-less starts are at least somewhat more interesting because it forces you to play your team differently than just playing your rotation on repeat like Spiral Abyss does currently. At least if you're not towing the line in terms of damage, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Overall, I think it's a compelling mode, but there are definitely certain aspects of it that limit its overall fun capacity. Like, for example, the freaking Cryo automaton, or just in general, the specific elemental restrictions on top of all the other restrictions the mode already poses. And in some ways, it just feels like a Spiral Abyss 2.0, and doesn't differentiate itself from Spiral Abyss enough to feel like its own dedicated endgame mode. Which is why I have a whole list of improvements which I think will at least help differentiate it from Spiral Abyss. Also, before making this improvement list, I polled, did I really poll? No, I made a community post where I asked my viewers, hey, you know, how was your experience with this mode? What kind of improvements can we make with this thing? And you all had some good input, and hopefully my list reflects a lot of what was said in that community post, along with my own thoughts and suggestions. So here we go. I'm going to start off with quality of life because this mode greatly needs it. There needs to be a UI or a menu to see what artifacts / weapons can no longer be used due to their inclusion in a different boss run. It's extremely frustrating to juggle around artifacts, in part because someone couldn't be bothered to make an actual artifact loadout system, and then be told that I can't use the artifacts I selected because I used them in one of the other 2 boss battlefields. It's just like, why? There needs to be a UI screen that tells us what weapons or artifacts we can no longer use. Because right now, it just tells you this, and this is not useful. Like, okay, thank you for telling me I have artifacts and weapons I used in battlefields 1 and 2. Can you please tell me what those are? Because I do not remember. I also find that some changes to boss descriptions are necessary. It's not a big deal for me because I look at external sources to figure out the finer details of how a boss works a lot of the time anyway, but I think at least some more details should be included in their detailed boss description. As it stands right now, the non-detailed and detailed screens are effectively the same for all the current bosses, besides one specific sentence for the Tulpa, or one specific section for the Tulpa. That's it. There is no difference otherwise. There's no information about how much resistance each of the bosses get, how much HP they lose when adhering to their mechanics, etc. These kind of things should be in-game, especially if you're changing the resistances between difficulties. What I'm specifically mentioning here is the Cryo automaton. In difficulty 4, you can trigger its Night Soul state, and that's fine, because it only gains 50% resistance at difficulty 4. At difficulty 5, if you go into the Night Soul resistance mode, it gains 110% resistance. For reference, if your team has no way to drop resistances, you're doing 63% less damage against this boss from difficulty 5 to difficulty 4 when it's in its Night Soul state. Just talking about the resistance change alone. Like, this information should be relayed to the player without having to go to an external site to get the finer details. Now, to be completely fair to the devs, there is a third description that does mention that the automaton will lose less resistance when put into this Night Soul state, or what the game calls as Counter-Strike mode. But, you know, 63% damage drop is quite significant, and I think, again, the numbers should be in this detailed screen, which, as you can see, in comparison between the two in difficulty 4 and difficulty 5 is just not there. And that's enough for the qual stuff. Let's talk about the buff system, or lack thereof. For whoever has cleared difficulty 6, doesn't matter if they cleared in 180 seconds or 2 minutes per boss, either or, as long as they cleared difficulty 6, the characters that they cleared it with go into whatever database they have and then are totaled. The top 16 characters, based on usage, are then given a 20% attack and 20% death buff, along with some, I think there's like some other thing they get as well, like HP or whatever. But basically, this buff is then given to those top 16 characters. And guess what? Those top 16 characters are going to be majority-wise the latest DPS characters or latest supports, to absolutely the surprise of no one, because that's what's going to clear difficulty 6. Designing the buff system like this as its current state just offers no flexibility and an indirect way to show specific characters, which is lame. Most people clearing difficulty 6 are not going to try and utilize older characters by default. They're going to use whatever is the most efficient, and, well, guess what's the most efficient? The latest DPS and supports. Sure, there are some standouts from this, like Bennett, Shincho, and Shenling, but these three have always been strong, and those are the few exceptions. The rest, pretty much all latest carries, pretty much all latest supports. So, in place of that, to take inspiration from a mode very similar to Stygian Onslaught, in Deadly Assault, you're able to choose a team-wide buff for the specific boss you're fighting. A similar thing can be implemented in Stygian Onslaught, and the player could be given the option to choose between, I don't know, 3 different buffs. Maybe one of them being give all characters 100% energy when the fight starts and additional energy recharge, for example. Alternatively, the devs could also just allow us to use the food buff system, which is already underutilized in the game. Either or would work. It's more helpful than whatever the current buff system is. That's just an Imaginarium theater ripoff. At this point, you may be asking something about, well, why don't you just allow all characters to start with energy to begin with? Personally, I think the no energy start is a mixed bag. It definitely makes some part of the game more interactive, because now you can't just do your rotation on repeat. You actually have to think about, okay, I have to make something custom for the first rotation at least, so that I can make the rest of my rotations run smooth. As a result, there's more skill involved in that sense. That said, I understand a lot of players are not interested in having no energy starts, which is why I'm suggesting this buff system instead, so that you can choose if you want to start with 100% energy or not, and then you can take a damage buff instead. That's why I think it's more adequate for a mode like this, because I think not starting with energy does test a bit of player skill. So that's what I'll say on that. Another thing that they can be easily implemented to make this mode better is making a combined timer rather than the separate 2-minute timers that are currently being used. To quickly elaborate on this, basically you would have 6 minutes to finish 3 bosses, rather than having to beat each one in less than 2 minutes. This allows the player to have more agency on how they want to optimize their clear. It also makes it less punishing towards players that don't have the correct characters for every single boss, because, hey, you know, say you can clear the Lava Dragon and the Tulpa in 90 seconds each, but you don't have a Skirk or a Scaffier for the Cryo automaton. Well, now, instead of just having 120 seconds to clear, now because you cleared the other ones 30 seconds faster, you now have 180 seconds to clear the Cryo automaton instead, right? Something like that. They're basically allowing the player to have more agency over their clear. And at least this is why I would think it should be fairly simple to implement, because they already do this kind of check to determine if a player gets the 5-star skin currently, so at least the most infrastructure code should be there. So to hold off on the moment, I know someone's going to be saying, why don't you just get rid of the timer entirely? I don't think this is an improvement, at least not without replacing it with something else. because a large part of Genshin's difficulty, whether you like it or not, is DPS based. Bosses currently in the game just simply do not have the damage to kill a lot of the shielding and HP options that Genshin's characters have to offer. Unless you are just face tanking everything under the sun, when have you seen your Zhongli shield break or Long Yen shield break, or had an enemy that could out DPS Chi-Chi's healing? Right, you probably can't think of any, and that's because with the way Genshin is designed, it's can you meet this DPS threshold while also having to deal with whatever annoyances enemies can give you that prevent you from reaching your maximum damage potential. And that's where skill is actively involved in Genshin, and this skill becomes more apparent when you're barely meeting DPS thresholds to clear. Because then you actually have to really think about, oh, how does my skill interact with an enemy? Does this ability actually cause it to do a different attack pattern? And I hope that at least some of my videos have shown that. That said, I don't think leaving the timer alone is the answer either. Right now, the biggest problem with the timer is that it's your only win condition. You either beat the boss or you don't. There's not much flexibility in this manner, so why not introduce a secondary win objective, or just a secondary objective? So in ZZZ, for Deadly Assault, there are ways to get points outside of just hitting the boss that you can get over the course of the entire run. And these things would be starting a specific boss mechanic or dodging a specific sequence of attacks. So what can be done in the case of Stygian Onslaught is introducing a secondary objective like that and making it, instead of that you have to kill this boss within 2 minutes, get a certain point threshold to then proceed to the next tier of difficulty. The idea of doing this is just to give the player more options in terms of being able to clear the difficulties. So say you're not able to do enough damage, that's okay. If you're more proactive about addressing the mechanics of the boss, then you will also get points. That's kind of my idea, like, of thinking with regards to this mode, is just allowing more choices. Speaking of allowing more choices, rather than just having to deal with 3 specific bosses, there should be some kind of boss pool. A boss pool of, say, 6 or 7, that players can choose 3 out of the said pool to fight and optimize around, with the additional condition that some of the bosses must not have any specific elemental restrictions. I think doing this makes it so that player has more of a choice on how they want to clear, which I think would be beneficial, and in the spirit of an open world game, which Genshin is last I checked. I have thought about more improvements, but I think I'll keep it at this for now, especially because I don't want this video to go much longer. It's already close to 20 minutes, so yeah. Also, I don't want to put more effort in until it's clear that the developers are actually interested in actively improving the mode rather than trying to make it shill specific characters. Hopefully this video relayed my thoughts on what is overall decent about this mode and how it can be overall improved. And if you have any other thoughts on Stygian Onslaught, please leave them in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching, and hopefully next video will be a little bit more interesting than this one. See you next time.